I just think this is a very, very interesting topic because me myself is a person that is being very, very conscious and, like I said, observably more conscious than people around me when it comes to how they choose to live their life and what are they living their life for. Like I had mentioned, I am unfortunately surrounded by a lot of people, even people that I love, that are so locked in to the present moment. It's almost as if they don't think the future will exist. The decisions that they're making aren't sound decisions, aren't wise decisions based off of hopefully what you were supposed to learn in the previous years of your life. You would think that if you had learned certain things, that you would actively try to apply them, which would be wisdom, right? You acquire knowledge in the present moment, you go through an experience, and the experiences allow you to go ahead and apply the knowledge, which would turn into wisdom if applied correctly, right? But it's almost as if you didn't learn anything at all. It's what did you do with your time? Like I said, who's telling the story? Who was telling the story in the first place? Was it you, or was it everything else that is dictating your actions? Which, for the better or for the worse, is probably going to end up in a less than desirable situation with your future self. Like I said, essentially what I'm trying to do is this, right? The last thing I want for you, and this is the last thing you should want for yourself as well, is for you to be thinking about you to be in the future moment, which is now the present moment, right? Saying, "Damn, I really should have made some better decisions. I should have listened to him. I should have listened to myself. More importantly, I should have listened to that voice inside that was guiding me, but I ignored it because I wanted to stay comfortable, because I wanted to stay safe, because I didn't want to know what else was out there, because I didn't want to put myself in that uncomfortable position to see what could have happened. That is what I don't want for you, and that is what you shouldn't want for yourself. And that is what most people don't want for themselves, whether they would like to admit it or not, right? Who's telling your story, man? Because think about it. I would like to think my future self is telling the story of my life right now, right? And the question is, how are they telling the story? Who's telling the story, and how are they telling it? That's very, very important. Because if they're not telling it with enthusiasm, if they're not telling it they're not telling it with praise, somewhat praise, right? You know, being thankful, right? If they're not telling with the thankful, with being grateful and thankful, right? Then maybe they're not telling a good story, and that might be what it is. But like I mentioned, right? If you want that for yourself as well, if you ask yourself the question, who's telling your story, and then you answer that question saying, I would like my future self to be telling the story. Okay, what would make that future self proud? What decisions today could make that future version of yourself that will probably exist, God willing, will exist? What would make them proud? Because if it's not a great decision, then like I had mentioned, you're going to be looking back and saying, "Holy shit, where did the time go?" Regret is one of the worst feelings to feel. Feeling a loss of time is also one of the worst feelings to feel. The only way to avoid that is to be making sure that your future self is telling the story of your present self in a way that is enthusiastic. Because if not, it was for nothing. It was honestly for nothing. I want to get into the second part of the podcast because I think this part is one of the most interesting parts that I've ever talked about in a podcast, right? And it is going to go hand in hand with what I mentioned earlier with who is telling the story, right? And this is more importantly something I need you to go ahead and reflect yourself because I was, just eating one day and I had came up with this idea because I found this idea to be very profound. And it is what I would deem to be all telling, right? It's in some type of capacity, right? It was reflecting on people who are great storytellers and what a great story consists of and things like that, right? And I came to the conclusion that a great story is more about who told it and how they told it as opposed to what actually happened. Think about that for a second. When you're hearing a great story, right? Everybody loves a great story. Everybody loves to sit down and hear a great story being told, right? It's if you think about it, regardless of what they say, it's usually more about who told it and how they told it, right? We've seen it all time and time again. I'm sure you've heard the same story from two different people, and it sounds like it had two different outcomes, it had two different reactions, right? Because, like I mentioned, it is not necessarily so much about what the story. It's not so much about what actually happened within the story, as opposed to, like I had mentioned, who told it and how did they tell it. So, like I said, this is one of the things that I found very very interesting. Something that you can go ahead and reflect for yourself, right? So like I said, taking that and applying that to what was said earlier. Who's telling the story? In my opinion, a great story would be told for my future self. And how they told that is also very, very important. And hopefully, they tell it, future champ, tells it in an enthusiastic way that is able to capture the attention of people around him. Just as you would want that for yourself, hopefully. Or maybe here's the thing. Maybe it doesn't matter for you. Maybe it doesn't matter for you. Maybe the person who tells the story is going to be your present self. And like I said, maybe you don't care what happens. You just want somebody to listen. But like I had mentioned, people are only going to stay and really listen is if that person is somebody they want to hear. That's it. So right now, are you building somebody that someone in the future is going to want to hear? Or are you not? Most people aren't. That's just what it is. Most people aren't. So that's why I say most people's lives and the story that they tell fall onto deaf ears. And that's just the reality of it. Right? And that's no fun in my opinion. Because like I said, I like to hear a great story. And I also like to tell a great story. And I'm sure you like to hear a great story. I couldn't imagine a world in which you didn't. Why would you do anything? Literally anything. You wouldn't watch any movies, you wouldn't watch any shows, you wouldn't really care for a lot of things in life if you didn't like to hear a great story. And like I said, who do you want to be telling that story as well? When we talk about the story of your life, right? When I talk about the story of my life, right? Who's telling that story? And how are they telling the story? Like I mentioned earlier, kind of. The story of your life should be a great story that everyone wants to hear you tell. You must live it out and then be able to tell it in an interesting way that people will stay and listen. Because if not, like I had mentioned, it's almost as if your story was for nothing. That's just what it is. And like I mentioned earlier, most people's lives, unfortunately, are very boring stories because they don't do anything that's worth even saying later on. So are you doing things that are worth saying later on? Or are you not? And why is that? Like I said, why would that even be a possibility for you? Evaluate. Why would that even be a possibility for you in your life? Because of the decisions you make. It all goes down back to the daily decisions that you make. It's all going to go down to whether you said, I wanted to stay comfortable or I wanted to do something that was, a little bit outside of my comfort. That is the difference. That is purely the difference between somebody who tells a great story and somebody who tells a story, but nobody wants to hear it.